Hi there, Gwen Raymundi again, and this is the second video in the series on ancestral trauma and internalized misogyny. And today I wanted to talk a bit about the ancestral trauma piece and how far back it goes and how it relates to our cultural relational trauma and to our culture today, as well as our internalized misogyny. So if we look back to the not very far past, relatively speaking, to the witch trials in Europe in the 14, 15, 16, 1700s, and look at the ways women were subjugated, the ways women were disenfranchised, the way women were dehumanized and made into evil beings. It's where witches came from. The term witch didn't really exist before then, definitely not in the way it was viewed by the Christian Catholic Church. And the methods that were used to disenfranchise women, to subjugate women, to dehumanize us. When we consider the absolute horror and torture that was involved in that, the burning people alive, burning women alive, drowning women, and not only hanging, beheading, right? All of these things happened, torture, rape, all of these things happened, and not in a private, sterile way. These were all done in the middle of the town square. So their mothers, their daughters, their aunts, their sisters, their neighbors could all be witness to the consequences of what it meant to be female and the consequences of what it meant to be an independent woman. Witnessing violence like that is a trauma in and of itself. It has been theorized that witnessing violence can be more harmful to our brains, our neural pathways, our brainstem, our limbic system. It can be more harmful to us than actually being the recipient of the torture. That being witnessed to creates its own special form of PTSD and its own special form of trauma that continues to live in our bodies. The witch trials were not the first nor only time that women were chosen to be othered and to be tortured, murdered, raped. Right? This happens in almost any war you look at. That there was the subjugation and the domination of women was a vital part of dominating another culture or taking over a land mass. It has been going on, for thousands of years in various parts of the world. Europe is not the only place this has happened. It's happened everywhere. This idea of the domination of women and the subjugation of women and the torture of women particularly has built in us a survival instinct. And if we consider particularly looking back at any of the events where women have been tortured, but I'm specifically thinking right now of the witch trials that happened, we can see how our survival instincts kicked in, right? If I'm watching my mother be tortured, raped, and then burned alive, you can bet that's going to have an impact on me and how I then raise my daughters and what I tell my daughters. It's going to have an impact on how I behave in the world, and it's going to have an impact on how I train my daughters to behave in the world, because it is about survival. It is about my personal survival, and it is about the survival of the species, and it is about the survival of my daughters. And we talk about, there's this term called the mother wound, and I despise that term for many different reasons. But the idea is the wounding that is passed down from mother to daughter. And I would argue that, you know, there is definitely wounding there that happens. And also, it is a trauma that is passed down, a trauma that has not been processed, a trauma that is continually passed down and reinforced by our culture today, right? As women, we aren't safe in the world. Rape still happens. Women are still considered to be property of men, even in countries like the United States and in modern Europe, where, you know, we are theoretically considered our own people, our own citizens. There are still homes and men who believe that their wives, girlfriends, partners are theirs, that they aren't an independent being, that they are owned. And that shows up as domestic violence. That shows up as murder of women by husbands, boyfriends, exes, right? All of that speaks to that we are still considered property. We are still considered less than fully human. Culturally, because the consequences to the men who cause women harm aren't very great. So we're still giving the message that, yeah, you did a bad thing, but it wasn't that bad of a thing, right? And we as women hear that message too. And so we continue to fight for our own survival and the survival of our daughters. And so we pass on this trauma and we pass on this information of how to survive in the world. Don't dress that way. Don't talk that way. Don't act that way. Oh, well, she did this thing. She deserves, you know, she was asking for it, right? The ways we do that. The ways we judge other women. The ways we judge mothers, whether we're mothers ourselves or not. There's so much judgment around mothers. There is competition. We are constantly competing as women with each other over perceived lack of resources. We are always being pitted against each other. Because a reality is, if we were to stop all that and we were actually to come together and band together, this whole system of subjugating and dehumanizing women would fall apart. Our culture as we know it would fall apart. We're beginning to see the beginnings of this with the Me2 movement and how women are beginning to speak up and out against sexual violence in particular, how men are actually getting, some men are actually receiving real consequences to their actions. And yet, we still have a president in the United States who very publicly admitted to sexual assault and sexual harassment. That gives us a message, right? And if we want our daughters to survive in the world, then we pass that message on. Our mothers received the same message. Our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, our great-great-grandmothers, right? We can keep going back. They received it in different ways. Maybe not as constantly as we do now in the modern world with social media and the internet as a general statement. And yet those messages were still very clear. In the year I was born, my mother was still not able to get her own bank account without her husband's, my father's, permission. That was still a thing. I'm only 46 years old. These changes that we've seen over the last 40 years, 50 years, have been important, they have been dramatic, and they have not been enough. because things like rape still exist, because domestic violence is still a thing, because women are still considered property, literally and figuratively, all over the world. And so it is vital for us to really look at the historical impact that brought us here today so that we can begin to unravel that. And instead of placing blame directly and only on our mothers or our grandmothers, instead of placing blame only on other women, we can begin to see the ways that culture and history and historical events really molded us today. That's why I think it's really incredibly important for us to look at our ancestral and intergenerational traumas and to begin to unravel them so that we can unravel our own internalized misogyny so that we can then create the space to truly bond with other women. And that takes time and energy and a lot of intention and a lot of willingness to be wrong and a lot of willingness to see how we ourselves have done harm. This is the second in a 4-part series called On Ancestral Trauma and Internalized Misogyny. It is a series introducing an intimate online circle that I am offering that begins on April 1st called Unleashing Ourselves, Processing Ancestral Trauma and Dislodging Internalized Misogyny. It's a 6-month program. The link to it is in, if you're watching this on YouTube, the link is down in the description. If you're reading this in my newsletter, if you receive this link as part of my newsletter, the link is in there. If you're watching this video on my blog, the link is below the video also. To read the essay that goes with this video, if you're on YouTube, the link is there in the description. I'll be back again next week to talk about some other aspects of ancestral and intergenerational trauma. And I look forward to connecting with you.